Maggie never expected standing up for an elderly biker would cost her job. But when she was thrown out onto the streets, she thought it was over, until the ground began to shake. The roar of 500 motorcycles echoed through town, and the diner owner realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. You do not mess with family. The morning shift at the small-town diner was usually uneventful, filled with regulars sipping coffee and sharing the latest gossip. Maggie, a 58-year-old black waitress, had worked here for decades, knowing every customer by name. She had seen good people, bad people, and everything in between. But today, trouble walked in wearing leather and arrogance. Tom, a 70-year-old white biker, entered, his steps slow but steady. His hands trembled slightly from age, but his posture was proud. He took a seat in his usual booth, nodding at Maggie as she approached. "The usual, hun?" she asked with a warm smile. Before he could respond, a group of teenage boys, all white, aged 17 to 19, snickered from the other side of the diner. Their leader, a wiry kid with a smirk that reeked of entitlement, nudged his friend. "Check out Grandpa over there. What is he still doing riding a bike at his age?" Maggie stiffened. She had seen these boys before, loud, obnoxious, and always looking for trouble. Tom ignored them, but the leader was not finished. He strolled over, hands in his pockets, and stopped beside Tom's booth. "You sure you should be out riding, old man?" "Might break a hip." Tom exhaled, clearly used to this nonsense, and reached for his coffee. Before the cup could touch his lips, the teen accidentally bumped into the table, knocking the steaming liquid all over Tom's lap. The entire diner went silent. Tom flinched, more out of surprise than pain, as the teen snickered. "Oops, my bad. Guess you are too old to hold a cup, huh?" That was it. Maggie stepped in, her voice sharp as steel. "Enough." She placed herself between Tom and the grinning bullies, her eyes locked onto the ringleader. "You better sit down, or I will sit you down." The other customers tensed. Some exchanged nervous glances, while a few discreetly reached for their phones, sensing the confrontation escalating. The teen scoffed. "Relax, lady. We were just messing around." Maggie did not move. Her stare alone was enough to make the boys hesitate. "Apologize," she demanded, her tone firm. The leader narrowed his eyes, clearly unused to being challenged. His lip curled as he leaned closer. "You will regret that." Maggie did not flinch. A tense silence filled the air before one of the other teens muttered, "Forget it, man. Let's go." With one final glare at Maggie, the group backed off, slinking toward a booth near the door. But the ringleader's sneer did not fade. This was not over. Behind the counter, Mr. Reynolds, the white 55-year-old diner owner, watched the entire exchange, his face darkening. He did not like trouble, and he sure as hell did not like his staff getting involved in it. Maggie turned to Tom. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Tom smiled weakly. "I have seen worse." She grabbed a napkin, handing it to him. "They will not bother you again." But as she turned, she saw Mr. Reynolds step out from behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Maggie had stood up for what was right, but now she was about to pay the price. The diner settled back into its usual rhythm after the confrontation, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The teenagers had slunk back into their booth, exchanging smug glances, while Tom quietly dabbed at his wet lap with a napkin. Maggie, still standing, took a deep breath, trying to shake off the frustration. She had dealt with disrespectful customers before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the blatant cruelty toward Tom, a man who had probably lived twice as much as those punks combined. Maybe it was how casually they had humiliated him, laughing like it was all just a game. Before she could process it any further, a sharp voice cut through the room like a blade. "Maggie! My office! Now!" Mr. Reynolds, the diner's owner, stood behind the counter, his face red with anger. Maggie swallowed hard, already knowing what was coming. She glanced at Tom, who gave her a subtle, appreciative nod, but she knew that would not help her now. She followed Reynolds to the back, the murmurs of the other customers fading behind her. As soon as they were alone, he turned on her. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, pointing toward the diner floor. Maggie folded her arms. That was me doing what was right. Reynolds scoffed. You do not get involved in customers' problems. You serve food, you refill coffee, and you keep your mouth shut. Maggie's jaw tightened. So, what was I supposed to do? Watch while they humiliated a man who did nothing to them? He is a veteran, for God's sake. Reynolds shook his head. That is not your concern. You embarrassed my business. You made a scene. Maggie stared at him, incredulous. A scene? I stopped them from harassing a man who could barely defend himself. If that is what you call a scene, maybe you should be embarrassed. Reynolds's eyes flashed with fury. His voice dropped, low and cold. I do not run a charity, Maggie, and I do not need employees who think they run this place. The words hit her like a slap. You are fired. Silence. Maggie's heart clenched, but she kept her face blank. Slowly she untied her apron, folding it neatly before placing it on the counter. Her hands trembled as she picked up her last paycheck from his desk. It was not much. Not nearly enough to get by. She turned to leave but stopped at the door. Her voice was softer now, almost breaking. I hope you sleep well at night, Reynolds. Because that man you just threw me out for, he would have risked his life for yours. She walked back into the diner, where the customers had grown unusually quiet. Tom, still at his booth, looked at her with heartbreak in his eyes. She forced a smile. I am sorry, sweetheart. Guess I will not be serving your coffee anymore. Tom swallowed hard. This is not right. Maggie touched his shoulder gently before stepping outside, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She sat down on a bench near the diner's entrance, staring at her paycheck, wondering what she was going to do now. Behind her, through the diner's window, Tom watched, his fists clenched. He owed her, and he knew exactly how he was going to repay her. Tom sat in silence, his hands gripping the coffee cup that no longer had any coffee in it. His old, worn leather jacket clung to his shoulders like a second skin, but right now, it felt heavier than usual. His gaze followed Maggie as she sat alone outside, staring at the paycheck that barely covered a week's groceries. The humiliation burned inside him, not for himself, but for her. She had stood up for him, and she had lost everything because of it. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out an old flip phone. The edges were chipped, the screen slightly scratched. It had seen better days. Just like him. He dialed a number he had not used in years. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Tom? Tom exhaled sharply. It happened again. Silence. Then, the voice on the other end grew cold. Where? Reynolds' Diner. Small town. You know the one. Another pause. Then a single reply. We will be there. Tom closed the phone with a snap, sliding it back into his pocket. His hands were steady now. He grabbed his cane, standing slowly. Every joint in his body protested, but he did not care. He turned toward Reynolds, who was counting the cash in the register like nothing had happened. Tom took a step forward, his boots heavy against the floor. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Reynolds did not even look up. He just laughed under his breath, shaking his head. Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do, old man? Call your little biker friends? Tom smiled. It was not a kind smile. Wait 2 hours, and see. Reynolds finally looked up, frowning, but Tom was already walking away, out the door, past Maggie, who glanced up at him with tired, sad eyes. He gave her a single nod. She did not understand what it meant, but soon, she would. Maggie sat on the bus stop bench, staring down at the cracked sidewalk beneath her feet. Her last paycheck rested in her lap, folded neatly but feeling useless in her hands. She had spent decades in that diner, pouring coffee, serving meals, offering smiles to strangers. And for what? To be tossed aside like trash for doing the right thing? She swallowed hard. Maybe it was time to leave this town for good. She exhaled, standing up, but then a low, deep rumble filled the air. At first, she thought it was distant thunder, but then it grew louder, stronger. The pavement beneath her feet began to tremble. She turned her head, confused. Down the road, a dark wave of roaring engines approached. Hundreds of them. People started stepping out of their homes, squinting toward the horizon. Customers inside the diner rushed to the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Inside, Mr. Reynolds furrowed his brow, setting down a plate of food. "What the hell is going on?" The rumble intensified. Then, they arrived. A sea of motorcycles flooded the town, engines roaring like thunder, leather jackets gleaming under the afternoon sun. 500 bikers. They rode in tight formation, chrome shining, boots hitting the pavement as they slowly rolled to a stop right in front of Reynolds's diner. The once busy street fell silent. The townspeople stood frozen, watching as the bikers killed their engines one by one. Then, Tom stepped forward. No longer hunched, no longer shaking, he stood tall, his presence commanding. He removed his sunglasses, looking directly at Reynolds, who had now stepped onto the diner's porch, his face pale. Tom's voice was calm, but carried weight. "We do not forget our own." The words sent a chill through the air. Maggie, still standing near the bus stop, gasped as she took in the sight before her. 500 men and women, strong, fearless, had come for her. For the first time that day, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. But this was just the beginning. The lead biker, Steele, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, took off his helmet and stepped forward. He was black, his silver beard adding to his aura of wisdom and power. His deep voice cut through the silence. "Where is she?" Maggie hesitated. Every single eye turned toward her. Slowly, she stepped forward. Steele nodded in her direction, his gaze filled with respect. Then, he turned back to Reynolds. "You made a mistake." Reynolds forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "This is crazy," he scoffed, though his voice lacked confidence. "Are you seriously doing all this? For a waitress?" A biker stepped forward, removing his helmet. He was a decorated military veteran, his chest covered in patches and medals. "We do not leave our own behind," he said, voice firm. Another biker, a woman with a scar across her cheek, crossed her arms. "This woman stood up for one of us, and you threw her out like garbage." Steele stepped closer to Reynolds, his presence towering. "You are going to fix this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Right now." Maggie's breath hitched as she realized this was not just about her job. This was about respect. And Reynolds? He looked like a man who had just realized he had severely underestimated the wrong people. The ground vibrated as the massive fleet of motorcycles idled in front of Reynolds's diner, their engines growling like a pack of wolves circling prey. The townspeople watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the sheer force that had just arrived. Inside the diner, customers pressed their faces against the glass windows, whispering in hushed, nervous tones. Then, the front door slammed open. Mr. Reynolds stormed out, his face red with fury. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, his voice sharp but laced with unease. Tom stepped forward. The frail, elderly biker who had been mocked just hours ago now stood with his shoulders squared, his stance solid. His deep blue eyes locked onto Reynolds with unwavering intensity. "This woman stood up for me," Tom said, voice calm but firm. "And you threw her out like trash." Maggie stood behind the sea of leather-clad bikers, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never seen Tom like this. There was no hesitation, no fragility, only strength. Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. All this over a waitress?" A massive biker stepped forward, his boots thudding against the pavement. He removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face and sharp eyes. The moment the light hit his jacket, several people gasped. His vest was adorned with military patches and medals, a decorated war veteran. "You insulted one of us," the veteran said, his voice a low rumble. "That was your first mistake." Reynolds paled slightly, but still lifted his chin defiantly. "I run this business. I can hire and fire whoever I want." Another biker, a woman with a long braid and a cold stare, crossed her arms. "Yeah? And how many customers do you think will be left after today?" Reynolds' gaze darted around. The townspeople were whispering, some even nodding in agreement. The diner owner was losing control of the situation. Then Steele stepped forward. The black man in his 60s exuded a quiet, commanding presence. His salt and pepper beard, lined with years of wisdom, framed a face that had seen battles, on the road and in life. He was not just a leader, he was a legend. He locked eyes with Reynolds, his voice calm but lethal. "Fix this. Now." Reynolds swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists, but his shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of hundreds of unrelenting stares. For the first time since this started, Maggie saw fear in his eyes. Steele took another step forward. "You had a loyal worker," he said, tilting his head toward Maggie. "And you threw her away. But here is the thing, Reynolds. Loyalty is everything to us." The decorated veteran nodded. "We take care of our own." The female biker smirked. "And we never forget." The tension was suffocating. Reynolds looked like a man who had just stepped onto a battlefield he was doomed to lose. His gaze flickered to Maggie. Her hands were clasped tightly together, but her face was unreadable. His jaw clenched, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. "Fine." A relieved whisper spread through the crowd. Tom's expression remained cold. "Number not fine. Say it properly." Reynolds's teeth gritted. He looked at Maggie, his pride visibly breaking apart. "Maggie, you can have your job back." The engines of 500 motorcycles roared in approval. Reynolds's face was still flushed, but now it was not just from anger. It was fear. He took an uneasy step back, feeling the heat of 500 unrelenting stares pinning him in place. "Look, this was just a business decision," he stammered, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. "Nothing personal." Steele tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "No," he said, voice like grinding steel against stone. "It was cowardice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their once neutral expressions shifting into judgment. The reality of what had happened sank in. Reynolds had thrown away a loyal worker, humiliated a woman who had served his business for decades, all to protect a group of bullies. People whispered among themselves, and Reynolds could hear snippets of their words. "This is disgusting. She worked here for 30 years. All because she did the right thing?" He could feel his reputation crumbling. Tom took a step forward. The old biker was not frail anymore. His posture was strong, steady. His hands no longer trembled with age, but with purpose. "You know what your problem is, Reynolds?" Tom said, his voice low and cutting. "You do not understand respect." Reynolds's nostrils flared, but he did not respond. Tom's sharp blue eyes burned into him. "This woman served your business for 30 damn years. Through slow days, busy days, through times when this place was barely scraping by. She kept this place running. She made people feel at home. She made you money." Reynolds' lips parted slightly, as if about to argue. But then Tom took another step closer. "And when she did the right thing, you threw her away like garbage." The murmurs grew louder. Tom straightened his worn leather jacket, looking down at Reynolds now. "Maggie deserves respect," he said firmly. "You owe her." Reynolds hesitated, his jaw clenching. He looked at Maggie for the first time, not as a worker, not as someone beneath him, but as a person. For a brief second, something like guilt flashed in his eyes. Then, his shoulders sagged. He let out a long breath and muttered, "Maggie, if you want your job back." But before he could finish, Maggie raised a hand. The movement was graceful, final, powerful. "No," she said. Reynolds blinked in confusion. The entire crowd fell silent. Maggie's face was calm, composed, but firm. "I deserve better." Reynolds' throat bobbed. He did not know what to say. Maggie turned to the bikers, her gaze landing on Tom. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. For the first time in decades, she felt free. For a moment, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Maggie's voice had been firm, unshaken. She had turned down the job that she had given 30 years of her life to. The weight of that moment settled over everyone. Then, Steele chuckled. Not out of mockery, but out of respect. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the diner's steps. His presence, just like his name, was solid, unbreakable. That, he said, his voice deep and steady, is why you are family now. Maggie blinked. Family? Tom, still standing beside her, grinned. His old, wrinkled hands reached behind his bike, grabbing something. When he turned back, he was holding a heavy black leather jacket, the same kind the rest of them wore. The patch on the back gleamed in the sun, a biker's insignia, a symbol of loyalty. Tom held it out to her. Welcome to the Brotherhood. Maggie froze. Her entire life, she had been an outsider. She had worked hard. She had given everything. And when she was no longer convenient, she had been discarded like she was nothing. But here, standing before her, was something far greater than a paycheck. Something she had never had before. A family. Her throat tightened as she stared at the jacket. You don't have to do this, she whispered. Steele smirked, shaking his head. Family ain't about have to. It's about who stands by you when it counts. Maggie's hands trembled as she reached out and took the jacket. It was warm, heavy, real. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she clutched it close to her chest. The bikers around her revved their engines in celebration, their version of a standing ovation. The crowd watching from the sidewalk erupted into cheers and applause. Some people wiped at their own eyes. Even those who had been skeptical of the bikers earlier now saw them differently. Tom chuckled, stepping closer. Well, come on now. First ride's on me. Maggie looked up, her lips trembling into a smile. Her whole life, she had worked for people who saw her as disposable. But now? Now she had people who saw her as irreplaceable. Without hesitation, she shrugged on the jacket. It fit perfectly. Steele gave her a single nod of approval. You ride with us now. Tom swung a leg over his motorcycle, patting the seat behind him. Hop on. Maggie took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She had lost a job, but she had gained something much greater. With one last look at the diner, the place that had defined so much of her life, she turned away, climbing onto the back of the bike. The roar of 500 engines filled the sky, shaking the very ground beneath them. As the massive group of bikers thundered down the road, Maggie felt the wind against her face, her heart light for the first time in years. And as she rode off into the distance, she realized she was finally free.